The room had gone completely still. Not the kind of still that happens when people are being polite. The kind of still that happens when people do not know what to do with what they're seeing. 43 people, every one of them in clothing that cost more than most people's monthly rent, stood frozen in the grand reception hall of the Hargrove Tower penthouse, and not a single one of them moved. Not toward the boy, not toward each other, not toward the man who had just dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor and was gripping his son's small shoulders and saying his name in a voice that no amount of money or power had prepared him to use. The boy was 7 years old. His name was Oliver, and Oliver had not spoken in 4 months. Not one word. Not to his father. Not to the 3 child psychologists flown in from different countries. Not to the speech therapist who charged $400 an hour and had written 2 books about selective mutism. Not to the pediatric neurologist who had ruled out every physical cause with the confidence of someone who had seen everything and understood most of it. Oliver simply did not speak. He sat in whatever room he was placed in, watched everything with dark blue eyes that missed nothing, and kept whatever was inside him locked behind a door that no expert had found a key for yet. His father, whose name was Grant Hargrove, had spent the last 4 months trying every key money could buy. And now it was the night of the annual Hargrove Foundation Gala. 300 of the most powerful people in the city gathered 52 floors above the street in a room that smelled of white flowers and old money. And Oliver had wandered away from the private room where he was supposed to be watching a movie on a tablet, and he was standing in the middle of the hall in his little dark suit with his hands at his sides. And he was shaking, not crying, just shaking. Small, visible tremors moving through his body like something electrical. Grant had seen him from across the room and crossed in about 4 seconds, and now he was on his knees on a marble with his hands on his son's shoulders, saying, "Oliver, Oliver, hey, look at me. You're okay, you're okay." But Oliver was not looking at him. Oliver was looking at something in the middle distance, some point above and beyond his father's head. And the trembling was getting worse, and the 300 guests had formed a slow, helpless semicircle at a respectful distance because they did not know what else to do. The head of Hargrove's medical team appeared from the far side of the room. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of bearing that usually made people feel better just by his being present. He crouched down near Oliver and spoke in a measured, warm tone he had been trained to use in exactly these situations. Oliver did not respond. The trembling continued. The doctor looked up at Grant with an expression that said he was not alarmed, but that he also did not have a solution for this specific moment in this specific room. Someone behind Grant said in a low voice that they should call the psychologist on retainer. Someone else said she was in London. Someone said they could video call. Someone said that might make it worse. 3 people were already on their phones. Grant looked at his son's face. Oliver's eyes had not changed. They were still fixed on that point above and behind his father's head. His small hands were still at his sides, not reaching for anyone, not pushing anyone away, just present in a way that felt like absence. And that is when the door at the far end of the hall opened, not dramatically, just opened, the way a door opens when someone has a cart to push and needs both hands. The woman who came through, it was not someone anyone in that room would have noticed on a normal night. She was wearing a gray uniform and a name patch that said Rose. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, average height, plain face, dark hair going silver at the temples. She had a cart with cleaning supplies, and she had clearly come to collect something from the service station near the door. She looked up when she entered, saw the crowd, read the situation in about 3 seconds, and started back out the way she came. And then she stopped. She looked at Oliver, really looked at him. Not the way the doctors had looked at him or the way the guests were looking at him. She looked at him the way someone looks at something they recognize, something they have seen before, something they understand from a place deeper than training or education or expertise. She left the cart by the door. She crossed the room. Nobody stopped her because nobody was watching her. She was part of the furniture. She was a cleaning lady. She had a gray uniform and a name patch. She moved through a crowd of 300 people without a single one of them really seeing her, and she walked up to within about 6 feet of Oliver, and she did not crouch down, and she did not speak, and she did not reach out. She just picked up an empty cup from a nearby table, a crystal glass that someone had set down half an hour ago, and she held it out, not to Oliver, Not exactly. She held it between them at about the level of his eyes, and she did something with it. Something small. Something that took maybe 4 minutes total. And then Oliver Hargrove, who had not spoken a single word in 4 months, said something. What did he say? And who was this woman? And how in the world did she know what to do when every expert money could buy had failed? That is what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into any of that, I need to take just a moment to talk to you directly, because you deserve to know what kind of place you've landed in before we go any further. This channel exists for people who believe that the most important things in this world are rarely the loudest ones. We tell stories here about ordinary people who carry extraordinary things inside them. Things they earn through loss and time and quiet persistence. Things that no resume could capture and no bank account could purchase. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever done the right thing in a room full of people who never noticed, if you have ever known something true that no one around you could see yet, then these stories are for you. They are made for you. So if you haven't already, please tap that subscribe button, because every week we put something here that I think you're going to need. And now I am going to tell you everything from the beginning, which means we have to go back a long way before we get back to that room and that cup and that little boy. Her name was Rose Calloway. She was 54 years old. She had been cleaning other people's spaces for 31 years, since she was 23, which means she started before most of the guests at that gala had finished college. She was born in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Garrett, which most people who were born there spent a great deal of energy trying to leave. Rose was one of the ones who tried, and one of the ones who came back, though not in the way she had planned. She grew up in a house with 4 kids and 2 parents and not much else in the way of resources. But her mother was a woman who kept a clean house with the quiet pride of someone who understood that order is a form of love. Rose's mother, whose name was June, used to say that a clean space is an honest space, that there's no pretending when everything is where it belongs. Rose grew up understanding that on a level deeper than words. Cleaning was not, in her family, something shameful or low. It was a skill. It was a practice. It was the daily work of making a place fit for the people who lived in it. Rose was a good student. Not exceptional, but good. She had a particular gift for noticing things, patterns, tensions, the small signals that something in a room was off before she could have explained why. Her teachers called her observant. Her mother called her a watcher. Her older brother Danny called her a snoop. But that was Danny, who never missed a chance to needle her and who she loved completely in spite of it. She left Garrett at 21 with a 2-year nursing degree and a job lined up at a hospital 40 miles away in a mid-sized city called Whitmore. She was going to be a nurse. She was going to help people. She had wanted to do that since she was 9 years old, and her father came home from a job site one winter with 3 of his fingers nearly severed by a saw, and the nurse at the emergency room, a compact woman with gray eyes and efficient hands, had spoken to him the whole time she worked on him. Not about his fingers, not about the damage, but about his life, his kids, his wife, the game that was on the radio that afternoon. And her father, who was a man who did not cry, had cried quietly on the way home, not from pain, from the fact that someone had seen him. Rose had been in the back seat, and she had understood what had happened even at 9. She had filed it away. She was 2 years into her nursing job when she met a man named Paul. He was a carpenter who worked on commercial projects, office buildings, hotel lobbies, the kind of large-scale finish work that required precision and patience. He was tall and he had a good laugh, and he was the kind of person who made a room feel slightly better by being in it. They were married in a small ceremony in Garrett when Rose was 24, and their son, Marcus, was born 11 months later. Marcus. This is a part of Rose's story that you need to understand before you can understand anything else about who she was and why she did what she did in that room 52 floors above the city. Marcus was born healthy. He hit every milestone on schedule, rolled over, sat up, walked at 13 months, started talking around 14 months. He was a bright, curious child with his mother's habit of watching everything before engaging with it. He had Paul's laugh. He had Rose's eyes. He was, in the specific and private language of every parent everywhere, their entire world. When Marcus was 3 years old, something shifted. It was not dramatic. It never is at first. He started pulling back, talking less, The words he'd been using, dog, more up, mama, daddy, started appearing less frequently, then rarely, then almost never. He stopped making eye contact the way he had been. He started lining things up. Blocks, shoes, spoons from a kitchen drawer, anything with consistent shape. He would spend 45 minutes arranging them in a row with the total focused attention of a person solving a problem no one else could see. Rose noticed first. Of course she did. She was a watcher, and he was her child. She brought it to their pediatrician, who was a kind man, but cautious in the way that pediatricians are trained to be cautious, who said, let's wait and see. Every child develops differently, boys especially. Some of them are late. And Rose had waited, and she had seen, and what she saw over the next 6 months was a boy slowly moving away from the world she shared with him into a world she could not enter. The diagnosis came when Marcus was 3.5, autism spectrum disorder. The developmental pediatrician who delivered it was experienced and compassionate, and told them clearly what they were facing, what resources were available, what the research showed, what the range of outcomes looked like. Rose had sat in that office and listened to every word and taken notes on a yellow legal pad the way she had once taken notes in nursing school, and she had not cried until they were back in the car and Paul was driving, and neither of them could find anything to say. What followed was 6 years of work. Real work. The kind that does not look like work from the outside because it is invisible and daily, and it never ends. Rose left her nursing job because Marcus needed more than a daycare setting could provide, and Paul's income was enough to cover the basics if they were careful. She became, by necessity and then by devotion, an expert in her son. She read everything she could find. She took a course in applied behavior analysis, and then another one, and then an advanced one. She found a speech therapist named Vivian who worked with children with complex communication needs, and Vivian taught her things about the relationship between sensory experience and language, about how, for some children, the ordinary world of sound and texture and light was not a background condition, but a constant, overwhelming foreground that made the act of producing language not just difficult, but sometimes physically impossible. This was the thing that changed everything for Rose. She had been thinking about Marcus's silence as an absence, as something missing. Vivian helped her understand it as a presence, as something there, as pressure, as a system overloaded. The silence was not emptiness. It was fullness. It was a child so flooded with sensory input that the pathway to language was blocked the way a road floods in a storm. Not gone, just covered, just unreachable in that moment by those means. And once Rose understood that, she started approaching the silence differently. She stopped trying to pull Marcus toward words and started trying to reduce the flood. She learned which textures overwhelmed him and which ones grounded him. She learned that a specific weight on his lap could drop his anxiety by half in about 3 minutes. She learned that certain sounds, low, rhythmic, predictable, could create enough order in his sensory world that the words could sometimes find a way through. She learned that waiting, real waiting, patient and undemanding and present, was more powerful than any prompt or technique or reward system. She spent years learning this, from books and therapists and trial and error, and the long, slow accumulation of knowing one specific child better than anyone else on earth. Marcus was 9 when he spoke his first full sentence in 2 years. They were in the backyard on a Sunday morning. Paul was at the hardware store. Rose was sitting on the back step with a cup of coffee, and Marcus was crouching near the edge of the garden, examining something in the dirt with the same focused attention he brought to his block arrangements. And he looked up at her. He looked directly at her, which he did not often do, and he said in a clear, unhurried voice, "There are 7 ants, and they are carrying something." Rose did not cry. She did not move. She said very quietly, "I see them. What are they carrying?" And Marcus said, "I think it is part of a leaf." And then he looked back at the ants. That was it. 2 exchanges. Maybe 20 words total. But they were 20 words that Rose had waited 6 years to hear. And they had come not because a therapist prompted them or a program produced them, but because Marcus was ready and the sensory conditions were right, and his mother had learned to create those conditions without him knowing she was doing it. The quiet morning. The familiar yard. No demands. No expectations. Just presence. Rose understood something in that moment that she had not been able to articulate before. She understood that the pathway to a locked-away person is almost never through the lock, It is through the environment, through the conditions, through everything surrounding the person, rather than the person themselves. You do not ask the flooded river to flow differently. You change the landscape the water moves through. Paul was killed in a workplace accident when Marcus was 11, a scaffolding failure on a commercial job site. He died before the ambulance arrived. Rose was at home with Marcus when the call came. She had sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the call ended, very still, in the specific way of a person whose inner world has just undergone a change so enormous that the body needs a moment to catch up. She did not fall apart. She did not have the option to fall apart, because Marcus needed her to remain functional, and she did. She buried Paul with his family and hers in Garrett, Pennsylvania, and she came back to Whitmore, and she found a way to keep going that most people, looking at her from the outside, would not have identified as grief because it was too quiet and too continuous to look like anything at all. She went back to work. Not nursing. She had been out too long, and requalification would have taken time she didn't have with Marcus needing so much of her. She took a job with a commercial cleaning company called Premier Clean that serviced office buildings and hotels and event venues. It was steady work with predictable hours, and predictable hours were what Marcus needed from her. She could be home by 3 when he got home from school. She could be there in the evenings. She could be present in the way that Marcus needed her to be present, which was consistent and calm and always there. She had been doing it for 12 years by the time she walked through the door of the Hargrove Tower penthouse on the night of the gala. She was good at her job in a specific way that people are good at things they have spent decades on without anyone watching. She knew how to move through a space without disrupting it. She knew how to see what needed attention before anyone pointed out to her. She knew how to be present without being visible, and she had made a kind of peace with that. The invisibility, she did not resent it. She had thought about it over the years, in the quiet hours when the work was automatic and her mind could wander, and she had come to understand that invisibility was not a verdict on her worth. It was just a condition of the role. The furniture doesn't get thanked either, and without it, no one has anywhere to sit. What the invisibility gave her, she had realized, was an unobstructed view. When you are not seen, you see everything. You hear everything. You are in the room for the conversations people have when they think no one of consequence is listening. You watch how people treat each other when performance relaxes. You notice the things that go wrong before the people at the center of the room do, because you're looking at the room from the outside in, and the outside-in view is clearer in certain ways than the inside-out view will ever be. She had worked the Hargrove Tower events twice before this gala. She knew the layout of the penthouse reception hall. She knew where the service stations were, where the coat room was, which elevator required a key card, where the catering prep happened. She knew these things the way she knew every space she worked, not from having been told them, but from having paid attention to them, because paying attention was what she did and what she had always done, and what had kept her and Marcus afloat through 12 years of single motherhood, and the particular, daily difficulty of raising a child whose world required her constant, calibrated attention. Marcus was 22 now. He lived in a supported living apartment 3 miles from Rose's house. He had a part-time job at a plant nursery where he identified and sorted plants with a speed and accuracy that had impressed everyone who worked with him, because Marcus's attention to pattern and detail, the same quality that had once seemed to separate him from the world, had turned out to be a kind of expertise. He called Rose on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He sometimes visited on Sundays. Their relationship was not like the relationships Rose had imagined when he was small, and she was new to all of it. It was quieter, more specific, more carefully negotiated. But it was real. It was theirs, and she would not have traded any of the hard years that had built it. This is who Rose Calloway was. This is what she carried into the Hargrove Tower penthouse on the night of the gala. Premier Clean had 2 employees assigned to the Hargrove Tower penthouse on gala nights. Rose and a younger woman named Debbie, who was 27, and knew enough the job that the scale of the venue still impressed her. Rose had long since stopped being impressed by scale. She had cleaned boardrooms and ballrooms and hotel suites that cost more per night than she made in a month, and the rule she had learned about impressive spaces was that they were just spaces, and they needed the same attention that every other space needed, maybe more, because the people who occupied them tended to be less careful with things than people who had to replace them themselves. She and Debbie arrived at 5 in the afternoon, 3 hours before the guests. They started at the far end of the reception hall and worked methodically toward the service entrance. Rose had a system. It was not complicated. It was just thorough, surface by surface, left to right, low to high, starting dry and finishing damp, never retracing a path if she could help it. Her cart was organized the way Vivian had once told her some people's brains were organized, by logic, not by preference. Everything in a place that made it most useful for what came next. She noticed things as she worked. She always did. She noticed that the floral arrangements near the east windows had been placed in a way that would create a visual obstruction for the catering staff moving between the kitchen and the reception floor. And she made a small note to herself to mention it to the event coordinator, which she did when the coordinator came through at 6:30. The coordinator moved 2 of the arrangements without much comment, which was how those interactions always went. The information landed, the problem was fixed, and Rose was not part of the solution in any credited way. That was fine. That was how it worked. She noticed that the temperature in the south section of the room was running about 3 degrees warmer than the north section, which would make the guests near the windows uncomfortable by 8 o'clock. She mentioned this to the building facilities contact, and it was adjusted. She noticed that one of the chairs at the head table had a leg that was slightly uneven. She could see in the way the chair tilted almost imperceptibly when weight was placed on the table nearby, and she flagged it, and it was replaced. None of these things were her job. Her job was cleaning. But noticing was what she did, and noticing led to the things she noticed, and the things she noticed, when acted on, made everything run more smoothly for people who would never know it had needed to be made more smooth. That was fine. That was also how it worked. By the time the guests began arriving at 8, Rose and Debbie had retreated to the service areas. Their job during the event was maintenance, keeping the bathrooms clean and stocked, managing any spills or situations that arose, collecting glasses and napkins from peripheral surfaces. They were not supposed to be on the reception floor during the event unless called. The guests were not supposed to see them. Rose was at the service station near the east door at 9:47 when she heard the change in the room. She had been working in rooms full of people long enough to know that rooms have sounds, and that the sound of a room changes when something shifts. The change at 9:47 was not loud. It was an absence of a certain frequency, the frequency of 300 people talking, replaced by something lower and more uncertain. Rose came to the door and looked through the narrow pane of wired glass set into it at about face height, and what she saw was a crowd pulling back from the center of the room in that slow, uncertain way of people who want to help and do not know how. She saw Grant Hargrove on his knees. She saw the small boy, and she saw the trembling. She started to back away. This was not her space to enter uninvited. And then something stopped her. Not a thought. Something older than thought. The same thing that had stopped her in 1,000 moments with Marcus over the years when the instinct arrived before the reasoning did. The recognition. That particular, specific way the boy was holding his body. Hands at his sides. Eyes focused somewhere that was not in the room. Small tremors moving through him like vibration, moving through a wire under tension. She knew that. She knew exactly what that was. She left the cart. She went through the door. She understood, as she crossed the room, that nobody was going to stop her. Not because she had any authority in that space. She had none. But because she was invisible, and the invisible moved through rooms in ways that people with status and consequence do not. Nobody looked at her. Nobody tracked her movement. She was part of the room's furniture, and the room's furniture was permitted to move. She reached the edge of the open space around Oliver and Grant. She did not go past it. She stood at the edge and she looked at the boy very carefully for about 15 seconds, assessing the way she had learned to assess. Not clinically, not from training, but from 30 years of paying attention to one specific person who was now standing 6 feet away from her in a different body. The trembling was sensory. She was certain of it. She had seen it enough times to know. Oliver was not frightened, not exactly. Oliver was flooded. The room, the sound, the light, the press of bodies at a distance, the smell of 300 people's perfume and food and candles had filled his sensory system past what it could process, and the trembling was the overflow, the shutdown in progress, the pathway to language being covered by the flood. She needed to reduce the flood. She needed to give him something to organize around, something predictable, something with a rhythm and a pattern, that his overloaded system could lock onto. She looked at the nearest table. There was a crystal tumbler sitting there, empty, left by a guest 20 minutes ago. She picked it up. She held it at the level of Oliver's eyes, just inside his field of vision, but not demanding that he look at it. And then she began. She tilted the glass very slightly, maybe 5 degrees, so the ambient light from the room caught the cut crystal and moved across the surface of the glass in a slow, shifting pattern. A small constellation of refracted light points moving across the glass like something predictable and alive. She held it steady enough that the pattern was consistent. She let it move just slightly so it was not frozen. Rhythm without surprise. Pattern without demand. She did not speak. She did not crouch down. She did not make eye contact with Oliver. She simply stood at the edge of his space and held the glass and let the light do what it did. She counted in her head. She had learned to count years ago, in the backyard with Marcus and the ants, because the waiting needed an internal structure, or the anxiety of not knowing whether it was working would crowd out the patience required for it to work. 15 seconds. 30. 45. At 47 seconds, Oliver's eyes moved. They moved from the point above his father's head to the glass. Not dramatically. Just moved. The way a compass needle moves toward north. Slow and certain. Rose held completely still. She kept the angle of the glass constant. She let the light pattern continue. 60 seconds. 90. The trembling in Oliver's shoulders decreased. Not stopped. Decreased, like a dial being turned down from 8 to about 4. At 2 minutes, Grant Hargrove, who had been watching this from 2 feet away with an expression that Rose had seen on parents' faces before, started to rise to his feet. Rose did not look at him. She made a very small motion with the hand that was not holding the glass. Palm down, fingers relaxed. The universal signal of not yet, wait, let it continue. He stopped. He sat back on his heels. At 3 minutes and 20 seconds, Oliver's right hand came up. Slowly, he reached toward the glass. Not grasping, just extending his fingers toward the way you reach toward something warm when you are cold. Rose tilted the glass fractionally toward him. The light pattern shifted, and he tracked it. His breathing was audible now, not distressed, just audible, the specific rhythm of a person finding a pace they can sustain. 84 minutes and 11 seconds. Oliver Hargrove turned his head and looked at his father. Really looked at him. Not the 1,000-yard stare. Present. Specific. The eyes of a child who has come back from somewhere. He said, in a voice that was slightly rough from weeks of disuse, "Dad, the light makes little triangles." The room did not react. The room held its breath. Grant Hargrove looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, because he was the kind of man who understood when to be careful, "I see them. They're nice." And Oliver said, "They move when she moves it." And Grant looked up at Rose for the first time, really looked at her, and Rose lowered the glass and took a small step back, because her part was done and she knew it. The doctor was there almost immediately, crouching down near Oliver with professional assessment running quietly behind his composed face. Grant stayed on his knees, one hand very lightly on Oliver's back, not gripping, just present. Oliver began to talk, slowly, in the fractured, observational way of a child who is reporting what he sees rather than telling a story, but talking. The words were coming. The crowd exhaled. You could hear it. 300 people letting go of a breath they had been holding, a sound like a tide going out. Some of them were crying, not making a production of it. Just the kind of quiet tears that come when the tension has been enormous and its resolution is gentle. Rose noticed a woman near the east window, pressing one hand over her mouth. She noticed a man in a gray suit who had turned away from the scene entirely, looking at the floor, jaw tight, doing the work of holding himself together that large men in expensive suits often need to do in secret. Rose started to turn toward the door. She had taken maybe 3 steps when she heard Grant Hargrove say, quietly and directly behind her, "Please, don't go." She stopped. She turned around. He had straightened up. He was standing now, and she had her first real look at him. He was perhaps 40, maybe a year or 2 either side. He was very tall, 6'2" at least, and he was wearing a charcoal suit that she could tell from 30 years of cleaning up after expensive things was a level of quality she did not have a precise name for. The tie was a deep midnight blue. The watch on his left wrist was slim and looked old in the way that things become old when they are taken care of. His face was the face of a man who was accustomed to authority, but who was, in this moment, not drawing on that resource. He was not looking at her the way he looked at the rest of the room. He was looking at her the way people look at each other, when they have just been through something together. "What did you do?" he asked. He asked it plainly, without the note of challenge that sometimes lives in that question when powerful people ask of people who are not powerful. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. Rose looked at him for a moment. She glanced at Oliver, who had accepted a glass of water from someone, and was now sitting very carefully on the floor with the doctor nearby, and his legs crossed and his hands on his knees in the specific, deliberate posture of a child managing himself. He was still talking. Not fluently, not comfortably, but talking. He was flooded. Rose said, sensory overload. He needed something to anchor to. Grant looked at Oliver, then back at her. The glass, the light through it, something regular, something he could track. When they can track something predictable, the system has a chance to reorganize. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, without hedging or apology. It doesn't always work. It worked tonight. "You've seen this before," he said. It was not a question. "My son," she said. That was all she offered. And Grant Hargrove, who was a man who had made billions of dollars by knowing when he had all the information he needed, and when he needed more, understood that he needed more, but that right now was not the time to ask for it. He said, "Thank you," and he said it in a way that made it larger than the words, in the way that certain people can do when they have the presence to pour real meaning into ordinary containers. Rose nodded. She said, "He's going to be okay tonight. But the room, the event, that's going to be too much for a while. He needs somewhere smaller." Grant nodded. He was already looking around for someone on his team, already putting the machine in motion. Rose turned toward the door again. She had a job to finish. She had made it about halfway to the service entrance when she became aware that someone was walking beside her. She looked up. It was Grant Hargrove, keeping pace with her across the emptying room, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has decided something. He said, "I'd like to compensate you. Properly. Whatever you'd like, cash, a position with a foundation, whatever I can do." Rose stopped walking. She looked at him steadily, without hurry, around them. The gala was beginning to reassemble itself. People returned conversations, the catering staff resuming their movements, the event beginning to flow again in a careful way that events flow after something has disrupted them and order has been restored. Oliver was visible at the far end of the room, being walked quietly toward the private corridor by the doctor, and a woman Rose took to be a member of Grant's household staff. Oliver's head was up. His hands were at his sides, but loose now, not rigid. Rose looked back at Grant. She understood what he was offering. She understood it was real and that he meant it sincerely, and that for a man in his position, it was not a small thing to offer. It was the largest category of thing he had, which was resource, money, access, opportunity. He was offering her the biggest thing he knew how to offer, because it was the biggest thing he had, and she was going to say no. She had known that since about halfway across the room. Not because she didn't need things. She did the same way everyone does. Not out of pride in the brittle sense. The kind that refuses help as a way of staying separate from the people who can give it. She was going to say no for a reason that was harder to explain, and that she was going to have to find the right words for, which meant she was going to have to think for a moment, which she did. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, I have to say something to you, and I need you to really hear it. Not as someone who just did you a favor, but as someone who has been walking the road you are now starting on for 20 years. He was very still. He was the kind of man who was good at being still when it mattered. She said, "My son Marcus has autism. He stopped speaking when he was 3 years old, and he didn't say a full sentence again until he was 9. In between those years, I had to learn how to reach him. And I want to tell you, I really want you to understand this. It was not the therapists who taught me the most important things. The therapists were necessary. I'm not saying they weren't. They gave me vocabulary and structure, and they helped me understand what I was seeing. But the most important things I learned by being with him. Specifically, daily, constantly, with my full attention on him and not on fixing him. There is a difference, a very big difference. Grant was quiet. He was listening in the specific way of someone who is not constructing their next response, but actually receiving what is being said. What you're going to want to do, Rose said, is throw resources at this. I understand that. You can. You can afford every therapist and program and intervention that exists. And you should use them. They will help. But the most important thing you can do for Oliver is not a program. It's time. Yours. Specifically yours. Learning what he needs away, I learned what Marcus needs. Not from a book or a therapist report, but from being in the room with him, watching, waiting, paying attention until you understand him the way nobody else does. She paused. Let that land. The cup, she said. The light. That was not a technique I read somewhere. I learned that from Marcus. I learned it over years of sitting with him when he was flooded and trying things and seeing what worked and understanding why. The reason it worked tonight is that I recognized what Oliver was experiencing because I have seen it 1,000 times in my own son. And the reason I've seen it 1,000 times is that I was there, present, for all of it, including the hard nights, including the nights when nothing worked. You can't buy that knowledge. You can only live your way to it. Grant Hargrove looked at her for a long time. The room moved around them. Somewhere at the other end of the reception hall, someone was beginning a toast. The event was reclaiming its rhythm. Nobody was looking at the two of them. The billionaire in the midnight blue tie, and the cleaning lady with the gray uniform and the name patch that said Rose. He said finally, "What do you need me to do?" She had been waiting for that question. She had not known she had been waiting for it until he asked it, and then she understood that she had known since she crossed the room exactly what she was going to ask for, not for herself, but for the thing that needed asking for. She said, "There is a program, a small one in Whitmore where I live, run by a woman named Vivian Carter. She's a speech therapist. She's the best I've ever seen with complex communication needs. She works with families for free or nearly free because most of the families who need her most can't afford to pay for her. The program is called The Lantern. They have 11 families right now and a waiting list of 37. They operate out of a rented space in a community center that has mold in the ceiling and a parking lot that floods every spring and equipment that is 15 years old." She looked at him directly. Fund them properly, not a one-time donation, an endowment, something that means they can hire 2 more therapists and move to a proper space and serve 50 families instead of 11. That is what I need you to do. Grant Hargrove looked at her. There was something in his face that she had not expected to see there, something that looked, if she had to name it, like relief, like a man who has been carrying a weight and has just been shown where to set it down. "Is that instead of compensating you personally?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he asked. And he asked it the same way he had asked, "What did you do?" Plainly, genuinely, without performance. She thought about this for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the true one. "Because what I did tonight was not a service I performed," she said. "It was something I know. And the thing I know, the thing that let me recognize Oliver and know what to do, it came from the hardest years of my life. It came from my son. It is not something that can be purchased, and so it cannot be compensated. If I take money for it, it becomes a transaction, and I will not make it a transaction. What I know belongs to Marcus and to the years we spent finding each other. The only thing that would honor it is to make sure that what I learned reaches more people who need it, through Vivian, through the Lantern, through the 37 families on that waiting list who are waiting for someone to see their children the way I learned to see mine." The room was loud around them now. The gala had fully resumed. 300 people were laughing and talking and moving through the beautiful room in the way of people who have processed something difficult and returned to the ordinary comfort of each other's company. Grant Hargrove reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a card. He held it out to her. "Have Vivian Carter contact this number tomorrow morning. Tell her to give them everything, the address, the budget, the waiting list, all of it." He paused. "And if there is ever anything you need, for yourself, or for Marcus, you call that number too. No transaction. Just call it. Rose took the card. She looked at it for a moment. It was a very plain card, which she had not expected. Just a name and a number. Nothing else. She put it in the pocket of her uniform, next to her cleaning cloths. She looked at him one more time. She said, "He's going to be okay, you know. Oliver, I want you to know that." She said it the way she might say it to someone who needed to hear it, not as a prognosis, but as a promise. The promise of someone who had been where he was going, and had come through the other side. Grant nodded. He could not say anything for a moment, which was its own kind of communication. Rose turned and walked toward the service entrance. She had a job to finish. She called Vivian that night, from the premier clean van on the way home, with Debbie half asleep in the passenger seat and the city moving past the windows in the way cities move at midnight, bright and quiet at once. She got Vivian's voicemail and left a message that was short and plain. She said, "Vivian, it's Rose. Something happened tonight. Something I think you need to know about. Call me when you can." Vivian called her back at 7:45 the next morning. Rose was eating toast in her kitchen. She explained what had happened. She told Vivian about the card and the number and what Grant Hargrove had said. There was a silence on Vivian's end of the call that lasted long enough that Rose said, "Vivian?" And Vivian said, "I'm here. I'm just Rose." "How much do you think he meant it?" "I think he meant it completely," Rose said. Another silence. Then Vivian said, "I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to call that number, and I'm going to have the presence of mind to explain the program correctly and not cry." "You'll be fine," Rose said. Vivian called the number that morning. She spoke with a man named Arthur Wellborn, who was Grant Hargrove's director of philanthropic operations, who had prepared for a call, which told Vivian everything she needed to know about whether the offer was real. Arthur listened to everything she had to say about the lantern, and the families they served, and the waiting list, and the mold in the ceiling, and the 15-year-old equipment. Then he told her that she would have a preliminary assessment visit from Grant's team within 2 weeks, and a full proposal response within 60 days. He told her to think expansively, not just about what the lantern currently needed, but about what it would need to serve its full potential capacity. He told her not to be modest. Vivian was not modest. The preliminary assessment happened in 10 days rather than 2 weeks. Grant Hargrove came himself. This was not something Arthur had told Vivian to expect, and when the gray car pulled up to the community center on a Wednesday afternoon, and Grant got out with Arthur and a woman who turned out to be an architect named Clara Benson, Vivian had been standing at the window watching for the assessment team, and had needed a moment before she went to the door. Grant was in jeans and a dark blue jacket that day, the first time Rose would have seen him without the gala formal where she had been there. But she was not there. She was at work, 20 minutes across the city, running a buffer over the lobby floor of a commercial office building. She did not know the assessment was happening that day, because Vivian had not wanted to tell her until there was something definite to tell, which was a kindness. Grant walked to the lantern space carefully. He looked at everything. The therapy rooms, 4 of them, small, the walls hung with the specific kinds of visual supports and sensory materials that Vivian had sourced over 20 years of practice. The waiting area with the worn carpet and the children's books in a basket and the lamp that made the light warmer than the fluorescent overhead. Because Vivian had learned early that fluorescent light in waiting rooms made the children more anxious before they went in. The storage room where the equipment lived, the weighted blankets, the compression vests, the noise-canceling headphones in 2 sizes, the bins of tactile materials sorted by texture. He asked questions, not the questions of a man performing engagement, but the questions of a man who actually wanted to understand what he was looking at. He asked Vivian how she assessed which interventions to use with which children, and she explained her process, which was detailed and specific and rooted in 30 years of practice. And he listened to all of it. He asked about the waiting list, not just how long it was, but who was on it. Vivian told him that the youngest child currently waiting was 14 months old, the daughter of a single father who had noticed she was not developing language on schedule, and that the wait for an initial assessment was currently 16 weeks. 16 weeks for a 14-month-old. Grant was quiet for a moment after she told him that. Clara Benson, who was standing slightly behind him, made a note on her clipboard. He asked to see the mold in the ceiling. Vivian showed him. He looked at it without comment, then looked at Clara, and Clara made another note. They stayed for 2 hours. When they left, Grant shook Vivian's hand and said that Arthur would be in touch by the end of the week, and the end of the week was a Friday, and on that Friday Arthur called Vivian and told her that Grant Hargrove was prepared to fund the full build-out and operating endowment of a new Lantern facility, including staff expansion to 7 therapists from the current 2, and a program capacity of 120 families, with a waiting list priority system that would get initial assessments done within 2 weeks regardless of family income. The endowment was structured so that the Lantern's operating costs would be covered for 20 years without needing to fundraise. Vivian sat down on the floor of her office. Not dramatically. Just her legs did not feel like holding her up, and the floor was there. The new building was on a plot of land 2 miles from the old community center. Clara Benson designed it. She brought 3 things to the design that had come directly from her conversation with Grant. The light had to be controllable in every room, individually, because different children have different relationships with light, and a space that could not accommodate that was not actually a safe space for the children it was supposed to serve. The parking lot could not flood, and there had to be an outdoor space, not a playground exactly, but a garden, a place with plants and controlled sensory experience, and somewhere to sit when inside was too much. The garden was the last thing Clara designed, and the thing she was most proud of. It had raised beds with herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, chosen specifically because their textures and scents were grounding rather than overwhelming. It had a section of smooth river stones that children could handle. It had a bench in a corner where the fence made a right angle, and the angle created a small pocket of acoustic quiet that could not have been there by accident. It took 14 months to build. During those 14 months, the Lantern operated out of its old space with a temporary structural repair on the mold situation, 2 additional therapists hired on bridge funding, and a waiting list that was now being actively managed rather than simply accumulating. The 14-month-old who had been waiting, her name was Iris, was assessed within 3 weeks of the endowment announcement and had been working with Vivian twice a week for a year by the time the new building opened. The opening was not a gala. It was a Tuesday morning in April, and it had a sign above the door that said the Lantern Center for Family Communication, and the parking lot did not flood, and the light in every room was right, and the garden in the back had its lavender and rosemary, and its bench in the corner with the acoustic pocket. 41 families attended the opening. Some of them had been clients for years. Some of them were new. Some of them were the families of children who had not yet found words and who were hoping to find them here. Grant Hargrove attended. He stood to one side of the small gathered group while Vivian spoke, and he was wearing a dark coat and no tie, and he was not the center of anything. He was just there. Rose was also there, standing with Vivian after the speeches, and Grant found her, and they stood together for a moment watching a small boy with red hair who was crouched in the garden examining the river stones with the full, specific attention of a child who had found something that made sense to him. Grant said to her, "His name is Thomas. He's 4. He started 3 months ago." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. Rose watched Thomas for a moment, the way he turned each stone in his fingers, the way his breathing was even and unhurried, the way the garden was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She said, "How is Oliver?" Grant's expression shifted in a particular way of a father answering a question about his child. It did not simplify, but became more open, less guarded. He said, "He's talking. Not always. Not easily. But he's talking." He paused. "I've been learning. What you said about being in the room, paying attention, not fixing, but being present. I've been trying to do that." "Is it hard?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and he said it without embarrassment, which she respected. "I keep wanting to do something, take action, solve it, and mostly the right answer is to just be there, do nothing except be there. It's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do." Rose nodded. She understood that completely. "It gets easier," she said. "Not easier exactly. More natural. You stop having to remind yourself to wait, and waiting becomes a thing you do, because you understand it's actually something. It's not nothing. It just looks like nothing from the outside." Grant looked at her. "Is that what you were doing in that room? When you were holding the glass and not saying anything?" "Yes," she said. "I was doing the most active thing I knew how to do. It just looked like standing still." He thought about that for a moment. "I've been thinking about that night a lot," he said. "About what it must have looked like, all those experts, all that money, all those people standing around not knowing what to do, and then you walked across the room with an empty cup. The cup didn't fix it, she said. The light through the cup gave him something to organize around. But what actually fixed it was the patience. The cup was just a way to make the patience visible to him. Grant was quiet. Around them, the families of the lantern moved through the space. Children touched the lavender. Parents talked in small groups with the therapists. The building was full of the specific, complicated, hopeful sound of people who have been carrying something difficult and have found a place that understands what they are carrying. Rose watched Thomas with the river stone. He had found one that was flat and rounded on one side, and he was rubbing his thumb across the smooth surface in a steady, repetitive motion. His mother was sitting on the bench in the corner, watching him with the patient, attentive expression of someone who has learned to be still. Rose thought about Marcus. She thought about the backyard and the ants and the 7-word sentence that had come out of 9 years of waiting. She thought about Paul, who never got to hear Marcus talk again after Marcus stopped. She thought about what Paul would have made of this day. The building, the garden, the families, the specific way that the things she had learned in the hardest years of her life had traveled from her kitchen table and her backyard in Whitmore to this place, and was now reaching 41 families and eventually 120, and threw them into futures she would never see. She thought it was the kind of ripple Paul would have appreciated. He had been a man who thought in structures, in things that were built to last. He would have liked that the parking lot didn't flood. She smiled briefly at that. Rose's life had not changed in the ways that people imagined change looked like when they thought about stories like hers. She was not rich. She did not have a new job or a new house or a new category in the world's understanding of who she was. She still worked for Premier Clean. She still drove the same car she had been driving for 6 years. She still lived in the same house in Whitmore where she had lived since Marcus was small, the house that had his growth marks penciled on the kitchen door frame, and that she would not repaint until she died. But her life had changed in a way that mattered, which was in its reach. Vivian had asked her, 3 months after the gala night, if she would be willing to meet once a month with the families on the Lantern's waiting list. Not as a therapist. She was clear about that. She was not a therapist, but as someone who had walked the road. Someone who could sit with a parent who had just received a diagnosis, or who was in the middle of a hard year, or who was losing hope that connection with their child was going to come, and tell them in plain language that it does come, that the waiting is not wasted, that everything they are learning in the hard years is the thing their child is going to need from them. That patience is not a passive state, but an active practice and a form of love so specific that it could not be purchased or replaced or imitated. Rose had said yes. She met with families on the first Saturday of every month. She drove herself to the Lantern, and she sat in one of the therapy rooms. She liked room 3, which had good light, and a chair that was the right height, and she talked to parents, one at a time, for as long as they needed. She did not call it counseling. She called it talking. She did not have a title. Vivian called her a family consultant, which was accurate enough. What she actually was someone who had survived something and had the grace not to make her survival the story. The story was always the families, the children, the person sitting across from her in room 3, who needed someone to tell them the truth without flinching and with enough love that the truth didn't feel like a door closing. She was good at it, not because she had trained for it, though the nursing degree and the years of watching Vivian and the accumulated decades of working in rooms where she was invisible and therefore saw everything, all those things had prepared her without her knowing they were doing so. She was good at it because she meant it, every word. The families could feel that. She had met with 48 families in the first year. Some of them she met once and they were fine or fine enough, and they didn't need her again. Some of them came back month after month, and those were the ones who were in the middle of the long road. And for those ones, she made a point of remembering every detail they had shared with her from the first meeting forward, because being remembered in specificity, not as a case or a category, but as this particular person with this particular child in this particular year of their life, was one of the most important things she had learned to give people. She got paid for the Saturday sessions. Not a lot. Enough. Vivian had insisted, and Rose had accepted, because this was different from the night at the gala. This was not a one-time recognition of something she had done. This was ongoing work. This was, in the truest sense of the word, Her gift, the thing she had been given by the hard years, and was now returned to the world in the specific form of 1 hour on the first Saturday of every month with a parent who needed to hear what she had to say. It was the same work, but larger. Her daily cleaning work continued, steady and invisible, and her Saturday work, visible, named, specific to her, reached further than she had ever imagined anything she did would reach. Marcus called on a Tuesday evening in November, 14 months after the night of the gala. This was not unusual. He called on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Rose was in her kitchen washing the dishes from dinner when the phone rang, and she picked up and said, "Hey, Marcus," the way she always said it, which was warm and unhurried and without expectation. He said, "Hi, Mom," which was also how he always started. Then he said, "I met someone today." Rose turned off the water. She dried her hands. She sat down at the kitchen table. "At the nursery?" she asked. "No, at the grocery store." He was looking at the succulents they put near the entrance, and he didn't know what kind they were. And I explained them, all of them. He said he wanted to buy one for his desk at work, and I told him the right one for a desk is the Zebra Haworthia because it tolerates low light. Marcus paused. His name is Eli. He bought the Zebra Haworthia. Rose had her hand on the kitchen table. She was looking at the place on the door frame where Marcus's height was marked in pencil. The marks that went from small to taller, a record of a boy who had been growing toward a person all along. She could see the last one, at eye level on the frame. She had written his name next to it, and the date, the way she had written his name next to all of them. She said, "That sounds like a really good conversation." It was, Marcus said, in his level, certain way. "He's coming to the nursery on Saturday to see the collection. I told him we have a Madagascar palm that's 11 years old." A pause. "I thought you want to know." She thought about what this cost him to say. She thought about what it had taken. The grocery store, the stranger, the succulents, the small brave act of explaining what he knew to someone who didn't know it, and then the larger and perhaps even braver act of telling his mother. She thought about the boy who had not spoken for 6 years and who was now telling her, in 11 sentences, that he had made a connection. She said, "I'm really glad you told me." He said, "Okay." She said, "Let me know how Saturday goes." "I will," he said. Then, after a brief pause that was characteristic of him and that she had learned to read as a comma rather than a period, he said, "Thanks, Mom." She said, "I love you, Marcus." He said, "I know. Me too." The line clicked. She sat at the kitchen table for a while afterward, not doing anything. The dishes were still in the drying rack. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window over the sink, the November sky was a particular dark blue of early evening, the specific color of the sky in that part of Pennsylvania, when the year is turning toward winter, and the light is going slower each day. She thought about Paul. She thought about the kitchen door frame, and the pencil marks, and the years they had all been in this house together, before the yard, before Vivian, before the long road. She thought about how Paul would have wanted to hear about this call. She thought about how much she still reached the phone sometimes, 14 years later, with something she wanted to tell him. She thought about how grief does not become smaller over time so much as it becomes more familiar, less like a wall and more like a room you live in, a room that has become, gradually, over years, habitable. She thought about the glass and the light, and the little triangles Oliver had described. She thought about the way the smallest things carry the biggest things sometimes, without anyone having planned it. An empty cup, a refracted light, a 14-month-old named Iris, a Madagascar palm that was 11 years old, 11 sentences on a Tuesday phone call. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when the dark blue outside the window had become fully dark, and the kitchen light, which was a kind of warm, ordinary light that houses have when the people are okay, made the room golden. She was going to be fine. She had been fine for a while now, but she sat there a little longer anyway, because some evenings deserve to be felt all the way through before you let them go. Now I want to talk to you, not as the narrator of this story, but as whoever I am to you right now, which I hope is someone who has just spent a few hours making something worth your time. I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually think about it, not before I'm thinking about it in the comments, but actually consider it before you write anything down. Have you ever known something true, really known it, knowing it the way Rose knew what Oliver needed, knowing it from years of living through the thing that taught you, and been in a position where no one around you could see it yet, where you had the answer or the understanding or the skill, but the room wasn't looking at you, and you had to decide whether to step forward anyway. What was that like? Did you step forward? And if you didn't, and there is no judgment in this, I promise, do you think you might now? I ask, because that is what the story is really about. Not the cleaning lady and the billionaire. Not even Oliver and the glass. It is about the moment Rose chose to walk through the door, and what she was walking toward, and what she was walking with. She was walking with 30 years of invisible work, and 6 years of hard learning, and a specific, painful, irreplaceable knowledge that no one in that room had paid her for, and no one in that room had thought to look for. And she walked through the door anyway. I think a lot of people have something like that. Something they know from the long road. Something real and earned and true. And I think a lot of those people are standing at the door, like Rose was standing at the door of that service entrance, looking through the little pane of wired glass at a situation they recognize and could help with, and wondering whether to go in. Go in. Tell us in the comments what you know. Not what you've been told or what you read. What you know. The comments on this channel are full of people who have walked hard roads, and they are some of the most honest and specific and human conversations I've seen anywhere. I mean that. Real people. Real things. Read them sometime if you haven't. If this story hits something in you, a like takes 2 seconds, and it means more than you probably think it does in terms of helping this channel reach more people who need these stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I would be really glad to have you. We put something here every week, and I pick the stories carefully. Only the ones that feel true. Only the ones that teach something by being felt. And next week, I have one that starts in a diner at 2 a.m. with a night shift waitress and ends in a courtroom 3 years later. And I don't want to say too much more than that, but I promise you, trust me on this one, you are going to want to be here for it.